Right, there we go. So, official welcome to the Beam Exchange Grab the Mic webinar. It's 22nd of October. So today's webinar is going to be about a piece of work that the Beam Exchange team has been doing for several months now in collaboration with a lot of volunteers from the industry, from the market systems development field. And the title of the webinar is How to Do MSD Procurement, and it's practical insights from donors and implementers. And it relates to an output that has been published a few weeks ago on what we call in the MSD Procurement series, with guidance to donors and implementers about how to cope with the particular challenges that arise in contracting and procurement for programs that use a market systems development approach. So I'm going to hand over to actually chair and moderate this meeting to my colleague Mike Classen, who did all the heavy lifting as regards pulling together this piece of these output and this piece of work, and his set of 4 speakers who I'll leave him to introduce, who were 4 of the volunteers who contributed to the process. So Mike, do you want to take over? And Mike, let me know when you're going to switch slides, by the way, so that I'm with you.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks so much, Mike. Great. Well, welcome everybody, everybody who's here live, and those that I'm sure, because of the ungodly hour in the Americas, may be watching this a little bit later. So this has been a piece of work that's almost a year that we've been at this now, and we've got 4 great speakers. You can see their photos there, and I'll introduce them in a sec, but there's a bigger group of almost 20 people. So 19 people participated in this initiative, responded to countless emails, and we spoke with each of those people individually to really understand what were they interested in about procurement. Based on those interests, we formed these 4 clinics or groups that met repeatedly. So each clinic group met 6 times at least. I think one may have met 7 over several months, and then several more months of writing together to try and really boil down the key insights. And so that's the MSD Procurement series that's been published. You should be able to see links to those papers from the emails we've been sending. And today's webinar is really about shining a light on some of the learnings, some of the insights, and some of the takeaways from that process. So we have one panelist from each of the 4 papers here. So a warm welcome to Roger Oakeley from the Springfield Center, Elin and Carlsson from SIDA, Grace Becton from Mercy Corps, Nina FitzSimons from Palladium on the PRISMA project. And the structure of the conversation that we're going to facilitate is we're going to start from the big picture, some high-level questions just to get things warmed up. Then we'll zoom in a bit and have one question that gets at least one dimension of each of the 4 papers. And then we'll close by zooming back out to the takeaways, and then we'll see what space there is for Q&A from you folks. So a big welcome, and let's dive in. So the first question is, why procurement? Why does procurement matter for MSD programs? What led you crazy people to dedicate so much of your time to this initiative, including Grace up at 6 a.m. and Nina far into the evening today? So we'll start with Roger. Your thoughts on why procurement for MSD?
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, probably not the most exciting subject of all, but actually really important. I think my interest stems from the fact that a lot of thinking and processes around procurement have been guided, if you like, driven by more direct delivery programming. And although that is changing, and although those sorts of processes are starting to evolve quite quickly and have been for some years, they are still in places lagging behind the dynamism, if you like, and the direction of travel of some of the MSD programming that we're seeing. So I suppose where I'm interested in here is to see the innovation, if you like, that's in the sector, focused on systems development rather than getting sidetracked into dealing with anomalies in the procurement process. So hopefully ironing out some of those residual anomalies.
Thanks, Roger. I'm an implementer on the PRISMA program as the Chief Operations Officer, and actually I fell into procurement purely by accident, and I don't know if there's anyone out there who actually starts with procurement as their main career goal. And while I can't say that I'm passionate about procurement, I'm certainly passionate about ensuring that MSD programs run well. So what I find is that a lot of times MSD programs try to pretend that they're something other than a development. And so what I need to say to my staff often is that, you know, the money that we're using is not our money. It's donor money, which means it's taxpayers' money. And so what I always try to say is that the principles actually of procurement still matter. So, you know, we've got value for money, we've got transparency and accountability, you know, we've got risk mitigation. But I think one of the things that we find with MSD programs is that sometimes they need a different approach to procurement. And the sticking point, I think, comes in how do you encourage competition? And I think that's where the tension lies. And that's what, particularly in our group, in the Fit for Business paper, we actually explored at some depth. So I think procurement is important because it's core to making sure that MSD programs work effectively.
I will get back to the role of procurement at SIDA and our MSD journey, but here maybe I'll just note that this is a quite profound existential issue for market development when you think about it. I mean, the move away from direct delivery approaches, as Roger was talking about, and combining with our quest to source responsibly for more adaptive solutions. The trade-offs there create a healthy form of tension. I mean, we really try to build better and more inclusive markets, both through our programs, but actually also through the way we channel funds to their implementation. So from that perspective, navigating this field of partner selection has quite fundamental bearings on inclusive market making globally, so to say. I mean, whether we acknowledge it or not, which makes it even more momentous of an issue for the future of MSD, as I see it.
Yeah, no, thanks for putting that in the wider perspective, Elin. Maybe just to follow up a bit more, I know you've been at SIDA for a while and really at the forefront of, you know, thinking about market systems from your agency's perspective. Do you feel like, you know, these days within your organization, you see procurement becoming a more important topic, or kind of the conversations taking on a different tone?
Well, I dare to say that there's growing recognition of how early programming decisions and sourcing strategies affect results on the ground. A lot has happened since we launched our first explicit MSD style policy paper. It was called Making Markets Work for the Poor in mid-2003. And since then, larger scale programming efforts has certainly intensified, and certainly over the past decade, although MSD programs remain a quite limited part of our portfolio for inclusive economic development. We conducted a strategic review of our MSD initiatives in 2018, which really strengthened the case for MSD within SIDA and identified a range of opportunities to do even more and better. That has helped building our capacity and toolkit, including how to navigate these legal complexities surrounding tenders and private sector engagement. So there's definitely a delicate balance here to strike between the needs for control of public funds at one hand and the needs to be relevant and effective and innovative at the others. So as we look closer at our institutionalization process for MSD, the task list there suggests that a number of our opportunities actually and challenges relate to decisive structures at the core of the clinic's mission and the group I work concerning decisive structure. So this means that the clinics really help boosting our efforts at the critical point in time.
Thanks. Yeah, I think it's useful to recognize that we didn't start this from a blank slate. I think there's lots of, internal debates and conversations within particular organizations, but the design of a clinic process, the whole goal was to bring people both from donors, consultancies, and implementation agencies together to see what happens when we, bridge those conversations. So the second question, and I'll go to Grace first on this, is, what did you personally, learn from the clinic's process, benefits or challenges from this type of inter-organizational interaction and kind of knowledge sharing process?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. So I'll just start by saying that I wanted to be a part of the clinics really after moving from a more field implementation role where I was managing kind of both MSD projects and more traditional development initiatives to a global technical support role. So that transition from, detailed work supporting operationalization of MSD partnerships to one where I was supporting a lot of MSD partnerships across many different countries, just emphasize kind of the extent of the procurement challenges across contexts. It just kept showing up again and again as a pain point. And I think the clinic process really provided an opportunity to hear how others are interpreting those challenges, responding to them, and an opportunity to kind of approach issues from the perspective of joint learning and problem solving, which feels pretty critical to kind of move the needle on these challenges in our sector.
Like just to chip in there, I think what I found was a confirmation really of the sort of shared interest, the shared agenda here for program managers, both on the donor side and on the implementer side. A desire, if you like, to try and deal with some of these issues, but often a recognition that the solution to those may not lie within the ability of those program managers alone to deal with, and that they lie in other departments and at the ken of other colleagues in those organizations, but there's a shared interest in trying to deal with some of those issues.
Well, I think that's kind of music to my ears, Roger, because that was certainly our experience with the group that was looking at putting together Fit for Business. And I think, for me, the clinic was an amazing experience because you don't often get to spend 4 months working with peers who I discovered were actually facing the exact same challenges that I was facing in my work managing MSD programs. And to me, it was, the clinics were almost a salve on the soul because I realized that the problems that we were facing were actually universal. And so it was great to be able to, one, share my experience, but for me also to take learning from other clinic members. And particularly in my group, for example, at the very moment that we had the clinic, I was experiencing this issue on the program where there was a very big dichotomy between the implementation team versus the operational team, with the implementation team intimating that operations was not flexible enough. And so it was great to get some ideas from one of our team members, Gwendolyn, who worked on the Bangladesh ABC program. And she talked about these bi-monthly sessions that they had between operational staff and implementation staff, discussing the barriers that they were having in terms of onboarding, private sector partners. And so from that, I was able to grab some, good hints and tips about how I could manage this dichotomy I was having. And, and then we were able to transfer that knowledge into the paper that we ended up writing, Fit for Business. So for me, it was just nice to know that, it was a global issue, which also iterated how important this clinic was and how valuable these papers are.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Nina, for that example as well. So here's where we start to, sharpen the wedge a little bit. Let's open up the box. You can see the cover of these papers, and you're starting to hear these kind of shortened nicknames of the titles. So let's dive into the first paper called Decisive Structures. And in this paper, a central part of it is a spectrum of procurement formats that's introduced. And so I'm going to ask Elin to just talk us through, what's happening in the spectrum, and from your point of view, why does this matter?
Sure. For the Decisive Structures paper, a range of sourcing options were explored, spanning from implementer-led to donor-led extremes in some sense, with several co-creative options in between. Implementer-led programs reach donors basically as ready-made proposals or programs, while donor-led programs reach implementers more like terms of reference for design, which is framed ex ante by the donor. While these two extremes have immediate advantages of various types of initial clarity, not least the most important engagement decisions here are made on quite theoretical commitments with a quite limited opportunity to try and test ideas prior to agreement. So in this sense, there are important advantages to build trust and explore a deeper fit for purpose in a co-creative environment. When exploring opportunities more dynamically across an emerging group of implementers, governance dynamics take shape, which actually add value also for like the kind of multi-stakeholder management we use in the longer term MSD implementation. And meanwhile, there are other factors, of course, aside from this co-creative dynamic, there are influential factors like that affect our outlook on possible partnerships, of course, such as the intended program size, what players can manage, what type of funds, various political complexities, local stakeholder composition, and track records on the ground, and the nature of the target group, of course, and their accessibility, humanitarian dimensions, and the general appetite for inclusive economic development among private players overall. So an important limitation of co-creation is that procurement regimes generally prohibit commercial implementers from participation. The room for adjusting terms of reference once a partner is selected in a formal procurement, it's very limited. So this means that we have also considered options for combining capacities from commercial and non-commercial players in this process and work in the clinics. And all in all, to wrap up my point, I guess we can say that the Decisive Structures paper explores the landscape of sourcing and the advantages and disadvantages of the various options, but also how these early decisions impact on the longer term implementation. For example, through effects on power distribution, accountability, stakeholder dynamics. They also impact cultures of knowledge management, capacity development, governance, and cost structures and incentives, financial regimes. So yeah, I think that's captures it pretty well, but you have to read the paper to know fully.
Yeah, perfect. And I think those last points you're making about, the idea of a decisive structure, you make some certain decisions that then are going to have ramifications and play out, depending on the length of the program, 3 years, 5 years, 7 years. And so I think, procurement of an MSD program, it's not a single point in time, right? There's different stages. And so I'm going to use that to transition over to Roger to give us some perspectives on the second paper called Deepening the Relationship. So in that paper, the partnership between donor and implementer gets explored through 4 stages of the procurement process. And so I want to ask you, Roger, from your point of view, which of these stages do you think is the easiest to overlook? What can donors and implementers do to give that stage or those stages a bit more attention?
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, so this second paper looks more at the relationship building through the procurement process between donors and implementers, and the 4 stages there, as you can see on the screen, from scoping through the bidding process, the evaluation of those bids, and then ultimately inception, which is increasingly important for a lot of MSD programs. I think if I was to pick one of them, interestingly, it would probably be the evaluation stage amongst those 4 that are particularly important. And why is that? Because that's where the signals are sent, essentially, for implementers and bidders to respond to, in the way in which they put bids together, the way in which they scope things, and ultimately the way in which they design their inception phases. So that bidding evaluation point is really critical. And if we get it wrong, if we set the wrong signals, then the chances are we'll get a suboptimal product and a suboptimal program coming out of the end. An obvious example is when you set very tight expectations, let's say, on skills of senior members of the team. You know, you have to have a 15-year experience in MSD or program management. And when you set those kinds of signals, you of course rule out people with 13 or 14 years of potentially highly relevant experience. And we have to be cognizant of the fact that those signals and those have major implications for the teams and the way in which projects are put forward. What can we do about it? I think it is that point around teams that's probably an important one. I think we all know, many people involved in these kinds of programs will recognize that MSD programs are only as good as the teams that deliver them. And so it's the team in a lot of this bidding process which is absolutely critical. And I think from a donor side, there is a need to really focus as much as is possible in this kind of context on the team. Particularly, is the team capable of delivering what the implementer is promising and what the proposal is putting forward? And you can do that through different ways, making sure that you're getting good references, making sure perhaps if you have the opportunity to interview key members of the staff. But it's also incumbent on implementers and those putting projects and teams together, I think, to think about what they need in the team, not to think in terms of lists of CVs, not to think in terms of documented curricula vitae, but to think in terms of how does this team come together? What sort of capacity building do we need to put in place to consolidate that team when we hit the ground?
Yeah, thanks, Roger. I think, what you've just demonstrated there by looking at the issue, taking evaluation criteria, but needing to see it from both sides. I think that interdependence between what gets set, the signal it sends, the response, and then, over years and decades, that kind of sets the feedback. I think that's one of the kind of brilliant contributions of this paper, is to not make it a blame game, seeing that interdependence. I wonder if anyone else wants to comment on this particular point, the importance of evaluation criteria, trying to shift it towards, broader team skills mix. Anybody else want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I mean, I can only agree that on the risk of assigning too much importance of the particular manager and the manager's CV, maybe even, extending that to attaching too much importance on particular individuals, especially if the team has been identified at the very early stage of a formal long-term procurement process. The implementer knowledge culture and performance incentives go well beyond a set of CVs, and while personalities and people do matter tremendously for success, a lot of things can happen along the way to signing an agreement, and unexpected delays are not uncommon. So all in all, it may not be possible to keep individuals on board for additional months or even years. In some cases, we've seen out and about. And this is why it seems so important to look beyond CVs, but also maybe look beyond individuals and assess institutional capacity and track records, a bit more widely, profoundly. Programs need to flow out of generally brilliant ideas and brilliant institutional settings. Maybe to illustrate that point, I'm a bit tempted to quote Warren Buffett, who was interviewed about the secret of his world-leading investment performance, and he answered that his secret is that he only invests in businesses that are so wonderful that even an idiot can run them, because sooner or later someone will. I mean, I don't want to deny the importance of a great manager, but there is a point to what he's saying, and I think it's speaking also to us.
Yeah, thanks, Elin. That's a good, I think a good counterpoint there, and I think, you know, we're scratching the surface of some of these points, but you do need to, you know, I think dig into the paper. Oh, we've got maybe one more point here. Do you want to add something, Nina?
Yeah, I think I agree with both Elin and with Roger, but I think it really resonates to me when Roger talked about experience of the team. But I just wonder how many people, who, particularly those who are in the audience, are thinking about, you know, the technical staff. And because what I see in most MSD programs is that bids revolve around those technical staff. And in many cases, the team leader is also technical. And bids very rarely have procurement people as core members of a bid team. And this was actually my experience on PRISMA. If we look at phase 1 of PRISMA, in the initial bid for PRISMA phase 1, all the nominated people in the tender were technical people. But I think what has been great on PRISMA is that we've actually been able to bring our donor, DFAT, along on our MSD journey. And it was interesting to note for the bid for phase 2, that in fact, they only had 2 positions, team positions that were interviewed. One was the team leader, and the other one was my position, which was the operations and procurement position. And I think what that says, and I think it was a very good message, is that, you know, that procurement is important, and DFAT recognized that having the right procurement person who could put the right processes and systems in place was important for the success of the program. So, you know, as an implementer, that was the point that Roger made on that really spoke to me.
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to keep us moving along for time here. And I think, you know, one of the things that rang throughout all of the clinic groups is that there's a big difference between the world of what gets written in proposals and then the rubber hitting the road of implementation realities. And so that's actually part of why we sequence the papers 1, 2, 3, 4. And so moving into paper 3, which is called Getting Off the Ground, we want to start thinking about this from the perspective of the program manager who is in place, whether they're good, bad, whatever. You know, how do they face the challenges, particularly in the startup phase, when not all the systems are yet in running and approved. And so I'm going to ask Grace, maybe tell us a little bit about, you know, both your own experience facing some of those startup challenges, but then really broadening to this paper's guidance. What does it tell people who are, you know, facing the struggles within the startup of an MSD program from a procurement point of view?
Yeah, definitely. So, I mean, as you're saying, this third paper really goes much more towards kind of practical tips for implementers that the group of us that participated all had when starting up MSD programs, just given that it's such a hectic time in a program's life cycle, but it can also really determine kind of the momentum of a program for months and sometimes even years to come. So I think within the category of MSD program startup, we considered a few different scenarios that you'll see up on the screen, up on the slide right now. And I think in my own experience, one of the challenges that I just wanted to speak briefly about is when due diligence requirements are a barrier to pushing partnerships forward. And I think that's especially challenging when MSD programs are operating in thinner markets. So in markets that, for example, have been impacted by a protracted crisis, we're often looking to partner with kind of small and medium enterprises that are maybe not as well established. And that can be a real challenge, given in those contexts, we're often working in much shorter timeframes, and we have to really balance the realities of the context with an organization and a donor's appetite for risk. So, I think small and medium businesses in these contexts often don't necessarily have the systems in place to be able to, for example, pass a subaward audit. And either the business itself might be scared off by kind of the due diligence required with a subaward, or a program maybe isn't willing to take on the risk of co-creating with a partner business that might result in disallowable costs later on. So I think, tight timeframes only exacerbate those pressures and make it tougher to kind of build trust on both sides when, for example, you're rushing to meet an agricultural season, which only occurs once or twice in a year and is a critical time frame for your program to demonstrate its value. So I think just recognizing that a lot of programs and organizations face these and other due diligence challenges. Some of the practical ideas in the paper that we talk about are, for example, making sure that you're engaging in collaborations that don't have funding attached via kind of a memorandum for understanding or an MOU that can be led by a program staff in partnership with a business, but doesn't necessarily require a transfer of funds. And that can allow you to move much more quickly, and is kind of a great place to start establishing partnerships. Or when we're working with partners that might not have the systems in place, seconding staff to our partners to help get those systems set up, and even linking funding disbursements to the operationalization of those systems. Just recognizing that approach kind of requires more resources on the program's side, and also trust building with partners. And then I think lastly, I'll just mention kind of for higher capacity partners, fixed amount grants that can reimburse partners based on milestones can often work well. Although just to note that those often require kind of prior donor approval and pre-planning. So I think those are the kind of tips that we talk about in the third paper for both due diligence as well as the other scenarios that are on the slide. And I just wanted to say that I think actually reading papers 3 and 4 together is a great idea, because I think the theme of relationship building across programs, finance, and operations staff is really cross-cutting and hugely important.
Great, yeah, thanks for mentioning that. There definitely was a sense of overlap and coherence between those two. I think this paper, Getting Off the Ground, does an excellent job talking about working within the reality, the constraints that you face as an implementer. But in the broader sense, I think it's equally important to wonder what's going on in the donor office when you're in the early stages of programming, So I wonder, just briefly, Elin, if you want to share your perspective, what are donors thinking about during early stages of implementation? How does that, is it the same issues, different issues, maybe a point or two there?
I think there are many things donors can do to be well prepared, and thereby avoiding to drag things down as things take off. We have to invest, of course, in our own MSD capacity continuously, and then I mean across the line of program officers, managers, controllers, and legal advisors, both at headquarters and at field offices. We, speaking for SIDA, we have tried to support officers like implementing MSD by developing a digital MSD toolkit containing kind of quick references to hot topics and guidelines for MSD, which is suitable for our conditions. So it covers different areas such as partner assessment criteria, key terms of reference for different functions, processes, and analytics, kind of get the bigger picture, to get a bit of a template that you can use to adjust to particular conditions. And it also covers like budgeting, adaptive management, budgeting for adaptive management, which is a hot topic with our controllers, how we risk manage and quality assure in light of the freer space we give for budget adaptation. There are also topic papers there and strategy tips for like the environments who operate like and the systems and instruments that we have, like conflict sensitive areas and humanitarian needs and climate change and public goods. And then not least, you know, in terms of investment vehicles and instruments like guarantees, if we want to use them in some kind of synergy with MSD programs, there's like a lot of thinking, and some simple guidelines can help overcome a lot of burdens, you know, when you agree on financial policies and forwarding of funds policies and things that are usually set up during the implementation or inception, and that can really end up taking a lot of time if you have to explore all these issues with your legal advisors as you go along. So, of course, we have also procured an MSD help desk for additional support where our internal capacities are stretched. And I think that's also important to kind of plan for the unexpected and have that extra buffer of capacity so that you don't drag things down out of lack of time, because a lot of things come in at the same time.
Yeah, thanks, Elin. A lot of important different issues and initiatives there. And I think, you know, talking about what can be done to, you know, avoid reinventing the wheel. What are those templates? What are those toolkits? I'm going to use that as a transition point so we make sure we cover some insights from the final paper before shifting over to the audience for questions. So the fourth paper, Fit for Business, really hones in on this question of, you know, the need to modify the internal procurement practices of an MSD program. And so, you know, within an implementation team, you know, different types of contracts and agreements for how to engage with market actors in different ways. So I wonder if Nina, if you can, you know, share from your experience, what does it take? What does it actually take to change those templates to make a more flexible partnership agreement? It sounds so simple, but I think in reality, it's more challenging. Can you shed some light on that and how the paper helps illuminate that?
Yeah, just look at the additional grey hair I've got. So I agree with what Grace said before. I think that it's really good to read Fit for Business, which is the fourth paper, together with Getting Off the Ground, which is the third paper. But certainly Fit for Business, paper number 4, is the go-to for implementers. So we all know that on development programs, you usually distribute your funds either through procurement or through grants. But MSD, we know, usually requires hybrid models. And when you're starting out, which I think is also mentioned in Getting Off the Ground, I mean, you have the program, which is very action oriented. You have headquarters who are very compliance oriented. And we have the donor who's very results oriented and generally has a low risk profile. So when you're wanting to actually manage an MSD program that requires flexibility and more dynamic processes, you actually, well, you need to have devolved decision making. And for devolved decision making to happen, when you've got those, you know, that dynamic between the headquarters and the program, you need to have trust. And so one of the themes that you see that runs through Getting Off the Ground and also the fourth paper, which is Fit for Business, is how do you build this trust? And it just seems such a simple thing, but it's something that, you know, many programs continue to struggle with. And so one of the principles that we have on Getting Off the Ground sorry, fit for business. That's because you've still got slide 3 on there, Mike.
Yeah, if we can advance one more slide. I'm tripping you up. Sorry, Nina.
That's okay.
Perfect.
Story of my life. So if you have a look at the slide, basically we tried to put our 4 months worth of experience and sharing into 4 basic principles, and all of those actually, particularly principle 2, 3, and 4, underlying that is this issue of trust. And one of the ways that we built trust, for example, with our headquarters, because in terms of modifying procurement systems and contracts, you really need to have this close relationship with headquarters. So quite by accident on phase 1 of PRISMA, the program manager from headquarters was actually seconded to the program. And it turned out to be an absolute blessing, because essentially that program manager was able to see how MSD actually worked in the field, was involved in daily meetings, could see the challenges that were faced by the implementation team. And so because of that, they actually became a very good advocate between the program and headquarters to allow us to have that devolved decision making. One of the other things that we talk about is really making proactive efforts to build this trust with headquarters. And so what the program, one of the examples I can give for that is that, with Palladium, we invited the risk director of Palladium to actually come and see our procurement processes. And once he came and did an audit and saw that our procurement processes were strong and robust, that also helped to open doors within Palladium. And after several years, and it goes back to Roger's point about making sure that you have the right people, it did take a while for us to get the right combination of people to allow this trust building. But once those were in place, we could actually start in a very piecemeal basis, but with Palladium to start changing the contracts that we had. And some of the modalities that Grace talked about just in her previous answer to your question, Mike, they are the types of contract modalities that we currently have. So what Palladium now has is essentially global policies. So they have a suite of contracts that can be used by not only PRISMA, but the other MSD programs that they're using. And that's great for Palladium, but it's also good for the MSD community out there.
Fantastic. And I know that, Grace, there are similar initiatives within Mercy Corps, and I want to ask you to talk about those, but I'm conscious of time. So I'm actually going to jump to a couple of audience questions here for 15 minutes. And then if we can, we'll get you all to give a 20-second, final point at the end before we wrap. So there's a question here from Holly in the chat box. Curious if in your experience or research, you've come across more inclusive criteria in tender documents. And we had a couple of pre-webinar questions on the same kind of thing. How do you ensure a procurement process can support increased diversity and inclusion? So a bit of a different lens here, but wonder if anybody has thoughts on that, ways the process or the criteria can be tweaked to encourage, a wider range of people to be part of MSD programs, and maybe also shifting the culture within program teams as well.
Yeah, that's a difficult one. It's just one thought, I suppose, in response to that. I think one of the problems that we may be seeing, certainly for some donors, is the size of MSD programming and the budget envelope that comes with it has grown over recent years. And that, of course, is a problem when it comes to inclusive implementation. I don't know what the solution is to that, but big is not always beautiful.
Anybody else from our panel have a thought on that?
I can't comment from the side of the donor in terms of how you ensure greater inclusivity in terms of the tendering process, but certainly a lot can be done in terms of ensuring that you have, diversity and inclusion built into the systems within the program. So for PRISMA, for example, we have a very strong diversity and inclusion policy on the program, and that is fed by headquarters, who also from Palladium headquarters, who also have this as part of the KPIs that are then built into our program. So from that respect, it's quite, I think it, like any other program, it's quite easy, but it doesn't answer the question in terms of how you ensure that, from the outset in terms of the donor tendering.
Thanks. There's a specific question directed to you, Elin, from Daniel Langfit. How can implementers do a better job of helping donor staff show that their MSD program is on track, even if it takes 3 or 4 years to show the kinds of results at scale that donor contract folks are used to seeing and measuring?
Well, as I see it, it's a matter of communicating expectations from an early stage. Either you submit a bid on a procurement, you can challenge some of the parts of the procurement. If you're lucky, it's even explicitly invited. But I think more importantly that, during the inception phase, you set smaller scale targets and process indicators and targets. Like, you build the trust by making clever forecasts. I wouldn't say the good implementer, the trust is built for implementers who always know in advance what's going to happen, who sets the perfect action plan. But the way that ambitions are communicated and how you relate to errors and deviations, and how you own up to erroneous projections, I think it's a lot in communication there, and setting clever process level indicators during the inception phase and building it up towards larger, more systemic development results.
I think another way of posing that question is this theme that came up a lot, Grace, in your group, and I know it's one of the 5 kind of challenging scenarios, this idea of quick wins. Any comments you want to provide to maybe elaborate on that from your paper's perspective?
Yeah, so I think, if you're looking for kind of examples of experience that other programs have had, recognizing that this is often a tension that programs feel, we talk about things like being really strategic about how you're organizing your startup teams. So, dedicating one team to setting up admin, financial, and procurement systems, a second team leading kind of the charge on inception phase analytics, and another one, potentially engaging market actors early to get something akin to kind of quick wins. So I think those strategic kind of how you're structuring your team early on, inviting donors to your MSD trainings, making sure that you have kind of just clear, transparent communication channels, and I think are being upfront about challenges as well. Helps to build trust early on.
Thanks. I'm going to just keep rolling here. We've had a lot of kind of interesting different questions. So there's a question and a kind of idea here from Kevin Billing. A key person in getting a good program is the background of the lead person on the donor side. So we talked earlier a lot about what are the criteria for the team leaders and the implementer side, but Kevin's saying, what about the lead person on the donor side? Sadly, this is an aspect that we least examine to avoid upsetting the institution providing the funds. Have you examined this in detail, which I would broaden to say, any parts from the papers that, or the discussions within your clinic groups that you feel, touched on this, or your own thoughts on it? Open to the floor.
From from my side, one of the issues that we touched on Fit for Business was actually how important it was to actually build the relationship with the donor. But this is not something that happens overnight. And how do you actually go from a transactional model, which, you know, not all, but a lot of donors operate from. So how do you change from a transactional model to more of a partnership model? One of the things that we on our program PRISMA realized is that we really had to understand from the outset what were the incentives of the donor and also what was their tolerance for risk. And then, as with our headquarters, we actually put in place a structured process for actually building that trust. The particular process that we used was a partnership brokering process. So it was actually a facilitated process. And interestingly, initially, our donor was very, not resistant, but was not sure that the process would work. And it has just been amazing to see that process work. And actually, if you look on 5 years on, 7 years on, because we've had been very lucky to actually maintain the same person. So they've actually been able to grow with that process. But if you can actually find, it doesn't have to be a partnership brokerage approach, but if you can find a very structured way to help build that trust and be very clear about what the expectations are and how you're going to communicate with each other and where the challenges are, it can really lead to, a real partnership approach, which we currently have with DFAT. And I think it's often very understated in programs. And that also requires talking about, the ghosts in the cupboard and the dirty washing. That also has to be aired.
I'll just jump in there. It's a good point, Kevin. And I think just an anecdote of a project a couple of years ago, a USAID project I was involved in, where the implementation team were a bit concerned about what they could and couldn't do contractually in dealing with certain tactics and certain things they wanted to do. And it was actually the program manager at USAID who was very familiar with MSD programming, who came in and said, look, let me deal with procurement. Tell me what you want and I'll make it happen back up the chain. And for me, it was a good example of, if you get the right person with a good understanding of MSD in that position, an awful lot can happen very quickly.
Brilliant. So we've got just 3 to 4 minutes here. And I think I'm going to ask each of you to take 30 seconds at the most to, tell us, what do you see as the most important takeaway from this whole exercise? And I'm actually we'll start with you, Roger, and then everyone else can chime in afterwards.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, just 2 very quick takeaways, I suppose. First is moving away. We need to move away from this subcontractor, them and us kind of relationship. I think there's a genuine appetite to do so, but it's not helpful. It needs to be a partnership, whatever that means in any particular context. But I also take away today from the importance of bringing staff that are involved in the management and procurement process into an understanding of what MSD is about. The more we can do that, and I would say from Springfield point of view, we see a few of those sorts of people come through training, but probably not enough.
Oh, great. I can sign up for next year's course then. My takeaway is that I think, if you want flexibility and adaptive management in MSD, which we do want, then I'm going to build on Roger's point that then you need to foster relationships also internally in the team between implementation and the operational side. And I think, operational staff need to be seen on a par with the technical staff. And for that, they need to have their capacity built. So I think I agree with Roger that operational staff, procurement staff also need to be trained in MSD. And by doing so, you can actually get the changes that you need within the procurement system.
I'll just build on that. I think it's such an important point. And I think if we're actually doing that and engaging procurement and finance staff in the ways that Nina is talking about, we can, you know, address challenges earlier on in the program life cycle as well. And I think it's not just relevant for country level staff, but really also for HQ level staff as well. So I think if we're building those relationships, we have a joint understanding of what we're trying to achieve. It just so helps you better balance appetites for risk for going after market opportunities. So yeah, couldn't agree more.
For me, I guess I realized that we may never have the perfect sourcing conditions, but there certainly is a range of options which can be more or less successfully explored by mindful experimentation. So we learn what chords to play, what plays out under what conditions, and over time we'll play the scales like Mozart. Anyway, I really want to commend Beam for launching this initiative and helping us on that way, because working in the clinics has really evoked a lot of insight, and it offered this 360-degree perspective on some common challenges, and it did nudge us a bit forward in making the best out of the conditions at hand.
Fantastic. Well, that's a great, strong note to end on. Thanks so much to the four of you for taking the time to both participate and to help us, you know, reflect on what came out of this. I hope that more folks will read the papers. We've been madly linking to them in the chat box, and do get in touch if there's ideas in there that you want to take forward. Thanks also to the other 15 participants. Some of them were on the webinar today. It's been a real pleasure to get to be a facilitator of this process, and exciting to have some of these outputs to share with you. So if you're able to take the online survey, give us some feedback on the webinar, we'd appreciate it. And hopefully some of these topics and tensions and debates give you inspiration for a future Grab the Mic webinar. So I think we're at the 1 hour mark. Thanks everybody, and it's been a great session.
Mike, that was fantastic. Thank you very much. And thank you, of course, Nina and Elin and Roger, Grace, really great webinar. Yeah, please do click on that little link in the chat box on the survey. I would really appreciate your feedback. I'd like to know what people thought. And if you've got any ideas about your own webinars, please let us know, or, you know, and we'll be happy to host something like this for you too. But all in all, a great session. Thank you very much. And Mike, thank you very much for being the consummate facilitator and moderator through this process that has gone on over 6, 7, 8 months. So it's been a real privilege to work with you. Okay, many thanks everyone, and have a great day or have a great evening if you're on your way to bed.
Brilliant, thank you.